Welcome, everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started this evening. The University of Washington acknowledges the Coast Salish peoples of this land, the land which touches the shared waters of all tribes and bands within the Duwamish, Puyallup, Suquamish, Tulalip, and Muckleshoot nations. We're so excited to have you guys. Thank you for joining us for Redlining in Real Estate. This discussion is part of the UW Libraries and UWAA Book Club discussion series around our current selection, The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America by Richard Rothstein. We're delighted to have you all here this afternoon. Before I introduce our moderator, I do want to remind everyone to take a look at the little microphone on your Zoom settings to ensure that you're muted. During the initial discussion, our staff will have the ability to mute anyone that's forgotten or does not know how. So just they might be asking you to do that. If you have a slow connection, sometimes turning off your personal camera can improve that connection. So just something else to be mindful of. This presentation, you probably just got a notification, is being recorded and will be posted on the UW Library's YouTube page after the event. And that recording will also include closed captions. Lastly, we look forward to a Q&A at the end of the interview. If you have questions that you'd like to ask, please utilize the chat feature in your Zoom settings. The chat button looks a little bit like a little message call out icon. If you don't see that, you may have to click the More button on your Zoom panel. So those are just, it looks a little bit like that. Now, without any further ado, I would like to introduce our moderator, Ms. Melanie Peterson. Melanie Peterson has more than 16 years of experience in design and construction, working on retail, housing, and hospitality projects. In her dedication to helping create a more equitable, healthy, and sustainable built environment, she shifted to development work after graduating from the University of Washington's MSRE program. She currently works for Forterra as a senior development and construction manager, where she oversees attainable housing projects. Outside of the development world, she's an active member of her community, serving on City Council for Sumner, as well as several boards. Melanie, we're so grateful that you are here with us today. Welcome.
Thank you. It's an honor to be here. And I'll just add to that a tiny bit that our topic tonight is especially impactful for me, as one of the projects I currently work on is in Tacoma's Hilltop neighborhood, a historically Black neighborhood that was also redlined and is now grappling with how to evolve without displacement. So this is very, very real to me. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our guest speaker tonight, Randa Privett. Randa is a real estate agent, a writer, and an independent scholar based in Seattle, Washington. Previously, she was a professorial lecturer in anthropology at George Washington University's Elliott School for International Affairs. Dr. Privett has taught classes in anthropology, sociology, global studies, cultural studies, and Arab studies at George Mason University and American University. She received her doctorate in cultural studies and has authored articles, book chapters, and books on Arab Americans. In Washington, D.C., Randa was also a part-time realtor. After moving to Seattle with her fiance and 4 cats in 2017, she became a full-time real estate agent based in Windermere's Mount Baker office. When not representing clients, she enjoys researching Emerald City's historic properties and neighborhoods. Hi, Randa. Thank you for being with us tonight.
Hi there, Melanie. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be here, and this book was a book that really woke me up, and I found it really fascinating. So this is the book for the UW's Alumni Club this month, and I am going to start with just a quick sort of summary of it for those of you who haven't read it. And if you haven't read it, I really would encourage you to read it. It is pretty thick and heavy, so the summary might even help some of the people who've read it. His main point, Rothstein's main point in The Color of Law, was that the racial segregation that we see now is not de facto. It's not a matter of choices or options exercised by individuals, and it did not happen by accident. His main point is that it happened in a de jure way, and this is a term that's often used, meaning the result of government policies and racially explicit laws, regulations, and government practices, which combined to create a nationwide system of urban ghettos surrounded by white suburbs. So here he's not picking on certain areas really. I think he's looking at it on a national level and using examples from certain areas, including Seattle. His main conclusion is that the federal, state, and local governments have sponsored and promoted racial residential segregation. And he does call people to action towards the end of his book. And he says that the government has a constitutional obligation to remedy this government-sponsored residential racial segregation and its ripple effect on school segregation. So this is part of his reason to write this book, is the current debates about racial segregation in schools. So he goes into the history of it rather than write about the present day. And he says that there are historical patterns of residence that were based on race. So up until 1930, there were explicit zones of race. So there were white and black areas of towns or cities that were sometimes legalized with city ordinances. And I would add to this that there were Chinatowns, there were areas that Italians were residents of. Sometimes they weren't ordinanced, but they were known. And I think that is still true. I mean, we just heard from Jessica that we are on Duwamish land and other tribes that were native to here. Well, the whole creation of areas that tribes are living is in a way a zoning, explicit racial residential zoning. So this ended in 1930 when the Supreme Court ruled that it was illegal for the government to force people to live in a certain area, that it was interfering with the right of choice. And so these city ordinances were no longer valid. So they turned to other ways in which, I mean, they meaning sort of this nefarious government blob, but it gets a lot more specific than that. Different ways in which to regulate where people lived by their race. So this is a really nice timeline, and we've worked hard on this. In 1934, we're starting to talk about redlining. So when the cities couldn't zone by race, the national government came in and did zoning by race through loans. So if we can see the redlining slide next. So in redlining, which is a term that not everyone's familiar with, was begun by bankers. Now, this is not by real estate agents, but by bankers. In 1934, the Federal Housing Administration, the FHA, was established as part of the New Deal under FDR. And it was established to provide insurance for loans to homeowners so that there could be more home ownership in the US. And what that really meant was more ownership and the creation of white suburbs. Because the FHA had a very explicit underwriting manuals. So they were providing loans for banks, and the banks would have to abide by the underwriting manual in order to get the FHA insurance. The FHA still exists, by the way, although they can't have the same racially explicit wording in the underwriting manuals. So the appraisal standards in these early underwriting manuals from about 1934 to about 1950 included a whites only requirement. That, in other words, that they would only provide the insurance for neighborhoods that that were explicitly white. And I'll get into how that gets done in a different way. And what they do is they drew up these maps, and we're looking here at a map of Seattle, and they marked the risky areas, right? So this was how they determined what level of loan they would give. So the better the less risky the loan, the lower the interest rate. So this is a significant savings for the homeowners and for the banks, more assurance for the banks. So the redlined areas were marking the risky areas. So here you can see in Seattle, you have the Central District, Chinatown, as well as Sodo in here, or parts of Sodo anyway, as red lines. So it's actually referring to the color in the map that was colored in to show the areas that the FHA would not give loans to. So homes in these red line areas were forced to get, if you wanted to buy a home in this area, you were forced to get a non-conventional loan through another bank, a bank that did not require the FHA as the insurance, or in the same bank, but it's choosing not to use the FHA backing. So once the denial of loans happened, that these non-conventional loans were often predatory. And I use that word loosely. We can get into it in the Q&A if you want, but it usually meant that there was higher interest rates and difficult terms. So terms like if you miss one payment, the bank repossesses your house. So very stark non-payment penalties, and not as much cushion that was given to, for example, the white suburbs. And this increased these costs because the monthly payments were high because the higher interest rates limited the homeowner's capital available for upkeep. And so the homes were more likely to deteriorate, which is reinforcing poor neighborhood conditions. And I should add that even to build a house, you may not be using the same building materials. You're going to be using inferior building materials than in the suburbs. So these two factors combined puts them at risk for being torn down in today's climate, where often the home values have increased, or the property land values have increased now that we don't have redlining. And these areas were also tended to be multifamily unit residential status. So it allowed developers to come in and replace a single family home, tear it down and put in townhomes with duplexes or triplexes, or even an apartment building. And that it sort of, the fact that these homes were redlined opened it up for development, and the current residents were displaced to other areas. Therefore, these areas that were redlined have lost a lot of their ethnic character. There's a lot of debate about it, as Melanie works on. But after the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968, it was illegal to discriminate on the basis of race. And that took away the power of these FHA loans that were supposed to be, for whites only, although that had been eroding for about 20 years. Studies have shown disparities between Black and Latinx borrowers and white borrowers in today's world, with the former continuing to be rejected for home mortgages and then offered higher rates on loans. So in Washington State, there was legislation put in place to counter this. It's called the Washington Fairness in Lending Act, which prohibits redlining today. So banks are not allowed to deny single family home application because the home is located in a particular geographic area. However, banks are allowed to discriminate based on the borrower's creditworthiness and the market value of the property in consideration of the loan. So now the loans were coupled with city ordinances that were then zoning upon land use and residency. So creating in the 1930s single family residence zones, industrial zones, commercial zones, and multifamily unit zones. And we still see these today. And the author is arguing that it was done to create and reinforce racial zoning. In other words, so the white families were zoned to single family residence, and the industrial areas were kept away from the white areas. And the industrial areas were placed and reinforced because of the zoning as buffer zones between inner city and these white suburbs. And of course, this has profound impacts on health. You know, we're talking from the 1930s until now. So there's a lot of time in which these health effects can be seen. So I want to turn right now and talk a little bit about the covenants, because the covenants were really also important in creating neighborhood by neighborhood racial segregation. And he does talk about them in the book. I think for realtors, the covenants come up a bit more than I think for everyone else. But these covenants were restricted covenants, and they were originally imposed, and still are. This can still happen, but not with the racial restrictions. Imposed by developers on homeowners through private homeowners association bylaws, so HOA bylaws. And membership in this HOA is required to purchase a house. So, you know, you often pay HOA dues, you have an HOA board, even if you're in a neighborhood that has single family homes. And these, in the 1930s on, that these 1920s to about 1948, these racial restricted covenants had whites only clauses, and they barred African Americans, Chinese Americans, Japanese Americans, Filipino Americans, and Semites. And sometimes these wordings were quite different, but they barred them from living in these neighborhoods. And these were written in the phraseology of the 1920s to 40s. And I'm going to show you an example of a restrictive covenant that is still in place in West Seattle, Alki, in the Williams edition. It is no longer allowed to be enforced because of the Federal Fair Housing Act of 1968. But here it is. The lot nor any part thereof shall not be sold to any person, either of whole or part blood of the Mongolian, Malay, or Ethiopian races, nor shall the same nor any part thereof be rented to persons of such races. So this is basically a covenant that is put on a house through a homeowners association that is barring the owner to be or to rent to anyone who's Chinese, Mongolian, Malay is Filipino, Ethiopian is African. And there were also racially restricted covenants throughout Seattle. And there's a really great project, the Seattle Civil Rights Project, done by UW, where you can check if your neighborhood has these racially restricted covenants that remain on the deeds. And it's done by neighborhood, so a micro neighborhood even. So like I said, it's the Williams edition of Alki. So in Seattle, the only open neighborhoods, and it's very helpful here to have that redlining map. The only open neighborhoods, meaning the only neighborhoods that were not restricted in some way, were in the Central District, Chinatown, and the International District. And in 1948, the Supreme Court ruled that these covenants, which were considered private because they were done by homeowners associations, were not enforceable by the state. So the police couldn't enforce them, the courts couldn't enforce them. So in 1948, it really took sort of the punch out of them. Between 1948 and 1968, there are cases that have shown that neighbors were able to threaten, i.e. if there was a potential buyer, if somebody had bought, they would try and drive them out. These are some examples. And then it's void and illegal. These covenants are void and illegal since 1968 with the Federal Fair Housing Act. So that sort of, those are the two main things I wanted to focus on, both redlining and these racially restrictive covenants. So I'm going to turn it back over to Melanie to interview me about the rest.
Absolutely. That was a great summary on a very dense book, as you mentioned. And thank you for tailoring it to our topics for today. Obviously, there's a lot to talk about in the book, but we're very focused today. So I do have a few questions prepared, but I also want to remind our guests to ask any questions that they have in the chat. So just keep those questions coming. So Randa, now that we've thoroughly established the active role of government in segregating cities, let's talk more about where we see these de jure practices continuing today.
Well, I think that's important. I mean, first of all, we have these zones of residence and land use that are still requiring single family homes to be on a lot that is this many square feet, and multifamily homes to have extra permission to be built. So there is still this bias for single family homes and lot size. And I think it's created a hierarchy in buyers' minds. This is maybe my realtor hat in terms of what is of value. De jure, you still see the government is legislating, and this time it's not for racism, but it's at least ostensibly against racism. So you do have the Federal Fair Housing Act, and this is reflected all the way down the line in our, for example, our codes of ethics as realtors, in the standards that are held by banks and by lenders. So explicitly, no. Implicitly, you could argue that it still exists, but then it's not really by the government exactly, unless you really see the legacy of our residential racial segregation going back to the 1920s and 30s when these zones of residence were put in.
Right. Yeah, to bring up zoning, I think is spot on, that is really where we see this continuation today, where we have this separation of, we say today apartments or single family homes instead of saying white and black. So I think it's really important for us to keep that in mind when we are looking at our cities and when we see initiatives come through. I think we're all familiar with, maybe not, with the work that has been going on in Minneapolis the last year, abolishing single family zoning, which sounds pretty drastic when you say it like that. But when you really take a step back to think about it, it's a great way for us to really densify and diversify our urban cores to allow more people into home ownership. So with that, so I think we've covered government. Let's move on to the responsibility of the agent. Can you share some examples of how this comes up in your work?
Well, obviously, we're all held to a code of ethics. The code of ethics itself does not allow us, and explicitly attests us all the time, on no redlining, no block busting, and no steering. So here, the redlining I've explained, but usually an individual realtor can't control sort of redlining. It's really more about the lending side. But block busting is when somebody, it could be a realtor, it could be someone else, is trying to get people to move out of a neighborhood, usually using a threat. Like the typical example is there's lots of people moving in here who are untoward and they were going to make the property values of your house less. So you should move now, and it's usually done for a short-term gain, i.e. so that they're representing the sellers and then they're representing the new buyers of the people who are moving in. And I have never seen that in my practice. And then steering is a little bit more subjective and a little bit more difficult as a realtor to be 100% sure you're not doing ever. So steering is when a realtor, usually this would be a realtor, directs a buyer to buy in a certain neighborhood that would match their color. And then, so that implies both typifying the neighborhood, but also typifying the buyer. And that is something that we're quite vigilant to not do. The ways in which it can be done, which is unfortunate, is through recommendation of lenders, of so requiring a pre-approval letter before you go out looking. I make that as a standard for for anyone who's buying with me. And instead of assuming a certain amount of money that they have to spend. And it is fairer to everyone if the buyer as well, if you know how much money you have to spend. And that does determine which neighborhood you can look in. Like it or not, if you want to live in this neighborhood and you have this budget, you have to figure out that you can switch that somehow, right? So something has to give. The market is really the determinant in the end of what neighborhood will work, in addition to the private preferences of the buyer. So usually when you are dealing with buyers, they have a preference for neighborhood before you're at all involved. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and let's talk about the homeowners a little bit. What is their responsibility in this? You had mentioned steering in your comments around what agents make sure that they don't do. I think it's interesting, homeowners are steered quite a lot themselves from their friends and family.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, of course. We all want to live in a neighborhood where we know people, right? That's part of, community and maybe why you're moving to that neighborhood even. So there's 3 areas that realtors often get into sticky situations trying to answer that buyers ask. So buyers always ask about schooling. Like, are the schools in this neighborhood good? And it's a valid question because they probably have children that they want to send to public school if they're asking you that question. We are not experts at evaluating schools, so we send them to where the schools are rated, which is seattleschools.org. And then you could question how these ratings are collected, or if they are racially biased or biased towards income in various ways, because obviously the school district is funded by the property taxes paid in that neighborhood. So it's sort of this symbiotic relationship that the quality of the school, it's not just about the leadership, it's also about how much money do they have to do sports and different activities that might spur the kids on to do better. And counseling and such. So we are not experts in schools, but schools are often, racially segregated as well as marked. The other things that we are asked about is crime levels. And again, we steer them towards SPD statistics or the statistics in that county. And, we can suggest that they walk around the neighborhood at different times of the day, which is a fair way for them to assess, I think. But we also get asked, is this a good neighborhood? Is this a bad neighborhood? I mean, we get all sorts of questions such as that. And those are very difficult for us to answer because it's subjective. So you kind of don't answer them really because anything I say is not necessarily how they feel. And it has to be up to them. But I do think that we talk about neighborhoods in a heavily racially laden way. And often, is this a good neighborhood? Is this a bad neighborhood? Is a stand-in for questioning race, the racial composition of that neighborhood. So it's something that I don't really like to, I don't answer. But I think that it is something that, here's where one of my recommendations is going to be to try and change the way we talk about neighborhoods and even think about neighborhoods.
Yeah, I think that's a really great point. Because what are we really asking, right? It's getting back to that point you mentioned earlier on really getting to know the homeowner and what they really need in their lives and have that be the best fit, not preconceptions about what this neighborhood may or may not be.
Mm-hmm.
So the book discusses a lot about the long-term outcomes of these practices. Mm-hmm. Something that we've had the opportunity to touch on before have been the opportunity for multi-generational wealth accumulation. Do we want to touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, you and I have had some really interesting discussions about this. For sure, this is true. One of the positive, or the most positive aspect about buying a home and owning a home is creating equity in your home. So instead of paying rent, you're creating home ownership equity. And it's a very important way in which people have built wealth over generations. So if you bought a house that was, let's say, $20,000 in Ballard in 1904, and you pass that home down to your children, they pass it down to their children, and then they sold it, for sure they made quite a bit of money. You know, if they sold it this year, for example, they would make almost $1 million probably for that same house, as long as it was kept up and all that. And that is a significant amount of equity. And during the home ownership, people can borrow money based on the loan, so taking an equity line based on the house. And the rising cost of houses is also something that's very significant. So all of these, the ways in which multiple generations can build up equity is significant. It's allowing people to take an equity line to send their kids to college, or an equity line to cover a healthcare crisis, or various other things. Meanwhile, they're keeping their house. So they're still living in the same place. So I think here you do see how home ownership can create multi-generational wealth quite easily and quite quickly. Of course, we have had downs in the market, like 2008, 2007 and 8. And that will, as long as you're not selling during that time, it can really create some wealth. Now, the question then becomes, there were entire swathes of our population that were not able to do this, right? So African Americans, to buy a house, they could not buy a house in Ballard or Wallingford, where the prices have significantly increased over the last few decades. So, you know, if they weren't able to buy a house there, then they weren't able to benefit from that multi-generational wealth, which has tons of knock-on effects in terms of sending the kids to college, or, you know, coming through a healthcare crisis, or having to move a rental place because your lease is up and the landlord doesn't want you to live there anymore. I mean, there's a million ways in which this profoundly affects multi-generational wealth.
Absolutely. So we want to make sure that we cover what can the folks on this call do. We've touched on being more thoughtful about language, but I'd like to go a little, here we go, you have a slide on it, perfect. We can talk a little bit about what people can be focusing on.
Right, I put this together because I sometimes think it's helpful. So I've already mentioned to talk of neighborhoods in less racially laden ways, but I would also like to talk a little bit about these restrictive racial covenants, which are symbolic at this point, but they're pretty, some of them are like the one I quoted, they're pretty nasty. And so the question is, can you take it off from the records, legal records, the deed of your home? And the answer is yes, you can. And Washington has actually had some movement on this issue in the last few years. You can strike the restrictive racial covenant from the records of your home, or the HOA can do it through a majority HOA decision. So they can take it out of the bylaws, which would remove it from the entire neighborhood that is covered under the HOA. Richard Rothstein on page 222, if you have the book, it encourages you not to strike it, but to add a paragraph at the end of your HOA bylaws that is talking about that this has existed, and we acknowledge that it has existed, but we are standing against racism and explicitly repudiate this paragraph in the HOA bylaws. And then I put it underneath, it's quite small, but that's the paragraph that he suggests on page 222. You can access these forms, right? So there's forms that you can submit to your local government entity through this website, and it's through the Seattle Civil Rights Project, and it's really a fascinating project. There's maps on there, there's more information on covenants, there's narratives that are really fascinating with examples from Seattle, as well as demographics, city demographics, and how those have changed over time, and you can check different races to see how they have changed according to what races you're talking about. It's a fascinating site. The other thing I would say is I think that when we're thinking about land use policy, people often say, well, that's fine, just not in my backyard, right? Like, I don't want a multi-unit housing in near my house. It's gonna, affect my house value. And that's usually the bottom line, is it's the property value. I mean, I think that here we have to rethink these sort of objections and think about how we can change land use policies so we would have more integrated neighborhoods. Another thing that I have become quite interested in is to be more aware of microaggressions and language. And to that end, my office is, and I was instrumental in this, is bringing in trainers to do DEI training, which is diversity, inclusion, and equity training of the agents, if they choose. And my larger company, Windermere, is also doing DEI trainings to make agents a bit more aware of microaggressions, among other things, and language. And so I think that we all work in various environments here. And in mine, I have pledged to stop using the term master bedroom or master bathroom. I think the Black Lives Matter movement has made me a bit more aware of just how bad that term is and how it can recall racial domination in a way that I don't wish to continue. So I'm going to use principal bedroom or main bedroom and adjoining bathroom. And that's just sort of my pledge, kind of, that, in my world, and everyone has different worlds that they work in. I mean, tech, for example, does use master and slave in terms of connections and in terms of servers and subservers. And I think that we could be better at how we use language. And I don't mean this in a symbolic way. I mean this in a way that makes people more comfortable, right? Who are working with us, whether it's buyers or whether it's a coworker or an employee or whatever. So I think that these are not superficial things, but speak to a deeper cause of trying to address some of the history of this country.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And that language is traumatic. I mean, you're right on about erasing that from the practice. And I think it's great for all of us to really think about how that shows up for each of us. I particularly like your point about advocating for change. A lot of times, this is the city council side of me. A lot of times folks are able to come into meetings when a development is being proposed, or at that time when emotions are high, both for council members and for the public. And I would just recommend that, now that you're thinking about this now, go in now before there's a project proposed and talk about, how can our city be doing a better job at creating a more equitable built environment? So it gets them thinking now when there's no pressure, so to speak, from an impending project, but gets them working on this.
Mm-hmm.
So we do have several questions that have come in from the chat. So thank you, everybody, and feel free to keep them coming as we go through. I'm going to go ahead and read our first one here. So it is U.S. prioritization of subsidizing property ownership in and of itself a racially discriminatory practice?
Well, the subsidization of property ownership, I mean, now there's programs that help first-time home buyers of any race that are government run. So there is an encouragement of the purchasing of homes. I mean, I think that this is the system we're in. I think that if you're talking about an entirely different system, such as a socialist or communist system, you're talking about revolution, and I am more talking about reform here. And so there are subsidization programs, although they're a bit wonky. Like some of them really aren't helping people in a way that I think is the most beneficial. So I'll give you an example, right? So this is not subsidization, but I'm giving you this example because I think it's significant. There was a co-op group near my house in Mount Baker, and they had to use the National Cooperative Bank, which is a national bank, right? And the National Bank had a requirement. These are first-time home buyers mostly. They're buying in it, that they had to put 20% down and pay for all the closing costs. Well, what first-time home buyer has 20% to put down? That's crazy. Right. And so basically they were taking these modestly priced co-op homes and making them insanely expensive to purchase. So I think that you look at other programs. So for example, with the FHA now, you only have to put down 3.5%. That makes it more accessible to a first-time home buyer. And conventional loans, you generally have to put down 5%, but even that could be possible for a first-time home buyer, depending on how much they've been able to save.
And I think those points about how just the down payment have moved, even in my time being able to purchase property, speaks to changes being made. However, if we look back across the history of these practices, I think they've absolutely been racially motivated and have had those outcomes that we've talked about. You brought up the co-op model, which is actually a model that we're using on the project I mentioned earlier. And the way that we're doing it, it's actually quite different, where the entire point is to make sure that people from the neighborhood are not displaced and that they're able to buy in at an extremely affordable, attainable rate. And we're trying even more to get it to be a zero down payment. We're working on philanthropy there to see if we can help get that co-op model to work for the people in that neighborhood.
Right. And so here, financing is everything. It's
Absolutely.
so important. And this goes to one of the other things that I think realtors need to be sure that their clients are not getting predatory loans. So, I mean, like, I always send a list of 3 lenders. All of them I have vetted, met with, talked about no prepayment penalties, or, what kind of rates are you getting? How are you looking at different options? And I do think that is a really key part of how you can help instead of make these problems worse. I mean, and also, I think that in terms of purchasing a house or believing you can be a homeowner, which is something I advocate because of the building equity, and capital in your life. Like, I think that it's important that everyone knows that they can buy a home. Now, it might not be in the neighborhood that's your first choice, but it is important to reach out to different communities in terms of home buying programs.
Right. Okay, I'll go on to our next one. If one talks about race in a latent way, is one not ignoring the manifested racial impact of the redlining on the neighborhood? For example, lower property values and its contribution to poorly funded schools or gentrification of lower income neighborhoods. Shouldn't we be talking about how to improve neighborhoods without displacing people?
Yes.
Absolutely. That is the crux of the project that I'm working on. How can we be different? There are several developments going on within blocks of each other, and we have really made a dedicated effort to make sure that we are not only involving people from the community on how this development should move forward and what it should look like and what it should contain, but also who is going to be able to purchase there. And so, it's not just market rate, it's very intentional about how to make sure that people from the neighborhood are able to build wealth in an area that it was withheld from them. So it is happening. It is important, but it could be happening more.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I think that my comment about changing the way we talk about neighborhoods is particularly talking about bad neighborhoods or
Right.
good neighborhoods, right? Like these are significant, and I don't mean that there aren't other ways to do things, but the way in which buyers come in and they think, okay, this is a bad neighborhood, I'm not going to move here, right? And I, of any race, I'm not saying one in particular or anything, or this is a good neighborhood, and you're evaluating that on the hierarchy that was put forward in the 1920s of a, you know, single family home with a garage, not near a road, you know, however many bedrooms. I mean, you know, it's a significant way in which people label, and when they label, it is racially laden.
Absolutely. You know, it brings the point up about, you know, a good neighborhood. I've always been told that Sumner, where I live, is a good neighborhood. And it's almost exclusively single family homes. It's, you know, outside of the city. And, you know, our police chief likes to remind us that our crime rates are exactly the same as Seattle, exactly the same. So we tend to use these terms about good and bad in a very uneducated way, because it really is just talking about race.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah. Okay, our next question here. Do you believe offer letters to sellers continue to have any impact on de facto segregation?
It's very interesting. I think it's a way of signaling race. Like it or not, it is. I mean, sometimes pictures are included. I mean, you know, if you own a dog, that, I mean, you know, like these, they're called love letters, right? From prospective buyers to sellers. I mean, I think that if we were going to be strictly trying to ignore the myriad of discriminatory classes, so there's 12 protected classes in Washington state, which is more than the federal, which is 7. So Washington state has actually gone sort of above and beyond of what classes you have to protect. And I think that these love letters, yeah, have potential for discrimination. But frankly, sellers will sell to the highest bidder almost always. And it depends on their financing, often more than the love letter.
Right.
So, I mean, whoever wrote that question clearly knows real estate. I would think it was a realtor that wrote it, because there's times when you're just like, oh no, should I submit this? Like, I don't want to, but it's allowed to submit it with your offer. It's submitted separately.
Right.
But that's a question. That is a question that realtors maybe need to think about on a local, but more really national and state level.
Absolutely. In fact, I just got one of those love letters. I have a home listed, and the realtor he's like, I would rather not pass this on, but I must. So
yeah, you kind of have to.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, our next question. When suggesting that buyers look at the SPD, the Seattle Police Department data, how do you counteract the over-policing of certain neighborhoods, predominantly non-white neighborhoods? Thank you, Barbara, for that question.
Right. I actually, that was part of my critique of what we can do. What else can we do? I mean, you can say read the paper, or you know, and then it's the media bias. I mean, all of it is pretty, it's more subjective, but it sounds objective. Like, I think that's the sort of fib. The fib is, look at SPD's crime statistics. I mean, usually I say, look at them in the context of what you understand, right? So I try and.
Yeah, I'm sure that you are a realtor that has these conversations with your buyers, helping them understand what those statistics really mean and what they definitely don't mean.
No, we don't really get into discussions of what they mean and what they don't mean, because that is getting into a gray area where we could be liable.
Thank you for sharing that.
I mean, we have a very strict code of ethics, and we are not allowed to steer, for example, and that could be construed as steering. And if somehow we're caught, whatever, for various things. I mean, like wording and listings, or there's a million things. Like we can get our license suspended. We can get it the license totally taken away from us, or our livelihood completely taken away. We can have fines that can be significant, like $5,000, that kind of number. Or we can be forced to take extra education classes, or we can not be punished. I mean, so it does run the gamut, but the top stakes are very high.
Got it. Okay. Our next question here is, where can I find policy for Whatcom County or Bellingham or other areas? Catherine is asking that.
Land use policy?
I'm not sure if this was for land use or if this was around maybe where covenants are. I'm not sure. Let's see here.
Okay.
For the covenants.
For the covenants. Okay.
For redlining.
So I would go to the Seattle Civil Rights Project, but they may not cover Whatcom County. And what was the other county?
Well, it's Whatcom County or Bellingham, the city.
Bellingham. Okay, so same thing. So what you really should do is go back to when you bought the house. You were given a deed that was from the title company, and it had a full list. And there was a paragraph where it said, check here for covenants, and you should have read it at the time. You may not remember it, or you may not have, but it's a link. And if you have covenants, that's where they should be. So you can either go back to the title company that you bought when you bought the house, or you can go into the county records. The county might have them. Usually they are really tagged onto specific houses. So the covenants are broad. They're not just about race, of course. They're about, like, I mean, they're really very broad, very detailed. But the county might have a records office in which you can ask and see if they have it. But I would also go to the title company, or you can order title from a title company, such as First American Title. I mean, there's CW Title. If you Google, you could probably find a good title company. And you'd have to pay for that, though, if the title was pulling your title. Yeah.
Okay. So this is our last question. And it's actually, it's a couple questions in one. So I'm going to read it all the way through, and then I can go back if you need me to. So is the Fed still monitoring adherence to the Fair Housing Act? Are cities still required to submit reports to the Fed? And even though redlining is no longer legal, overtly endorsed by the government, how is it and its impacts still manifested structurally? That's from Marilyn.
Okay. Start with the first ones.
Adherence. Is the Fed still monitoring adherence to the Fair Housing Act?
Yes and no. I mean, a lot of these resources of Feds monitoring anything have been diminished.
Right.
So I don't know how extensive they are monitoring it. I think usually it would be somebody who's bringing a lawsuit and using the Federal Fair Housing Act as their basis of complaint.
Right.
Yeah.
Are you aware if cities are still required to submit reports?
I'm not aware of that.
Okay. And then this last one, we can definitely speak to, even though the redlining is no longer legal, overtly endorsed by the government, how is it and its impacts still manifested structurally? We touched on this a bit.
Profoundly, I think it's still seen today. The effects of redlining are just, I mean, they're profound. They're profound in the zoning, right?
Right.
So certain redlined areas were zoned a certain way. They were zoned more multifamily, or they were zoned industrial/residential, or they were zoned industrial or commercial. I mean, it depended on the era as to how it was termed. So you still see that, right?
Right.
So you still have the white suburbs that are zoned as single family. This is a significant thing because that has maintained home prices. It does maintain property values because there's a demand for single family homes.
Right. I think another really impactful manifestation of this are common health impacts. So people that live in redline neighborhoods, as we've mentioned, have shorter lifespans.
Mhm.
I mean, they literally live less because of this is a very sad outcome of this kind of structural racism.
Mhm.
Yeah,
And in the actual building's quality.
absolutely.
Like I said, redline neighborhoods tend to have houses that are more deteriorated over time. I mean, if they were built in the 50s, there's a significant difference when you get to 2020. And this you still see. I mean, I'm not saying that the houses weren't built well always, but there was less capital for upkeep.
Right.
Even if they were built well in the beginning, if there was less capital for upkeep or more people renting it as opposed to living in it, and then the renters generally don't take as good care as homeowners in any neighborhood. But it has created an effect, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, even in the materials, you talked about that as well earlier. You know, there's a higher likelihood that there is lead paint, which has traumatic effects on children that live in those homes. So it's
Whereas
not
in a more expensive home, somebody might take out the lead paint.
exactly.
Right? And lead paint can affect brains and, all sorts of health effects, which is sort of tying back to what you were saying, Melanie.
Right. So I know we could both go on and on, but I want to make sure we give our UW folks here a moment to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you.
So thank you so much to Melanie and Randa. This is such an important topic. I know that there's still a lot of conversation that needs to happen and that obviously people want to happen. Luckily, we are really excited to offer offer some more discussion groups next week. For example, we have the Colored Law Book Club discussion, which will be formatted a little bit more like an actual book club discussion where we're excited to hear your ideas and your thoughts to help carry that conversation forward. Amy's dropping in the link to the book club. You do not need to be a UWA. You don't need to be an alumni or anything to join the book club. You can certainly just sign up. There's also a discussion board there. So if you have some thoughts, I know that there's already been a lot of engagement on that site. So it's a great opportunity to get those ideas out. We've kept you for a full hour here, and obviously there's still a lot of conversation happening, but those are some good resources for you. We also have additional events through the libraries that you can take a look at. We will send out a follow-up email with a list of the resources, which a lot of them are coming from the Seattle Civil Rights and Labor History Project through the University of Washington, as Randa mentioned. So we'll include some of those links as well. I know a lot of folks were inquiring about that. And then just another thing to keep on your radar, as you all seem very invested in this book, is that the author is actually going to be speaking at Town Hall Seattle on Monday, October 12th. So that's another place for you to kind of engage with that as well. So all of those will be in that follow-up email for you to continue this thought. We're so excited that so many of you joined us this evening. It's very exciting to us to hear from you and to see how many people are interested in this particular topic. So thank you again to Melanie and Randa. Thank you to UWAA. And yeah, thanks for joining University Libraries.
Thank you.